President of External Affairs at the Daniel Morgan Graduate School, and I also have the honor of being the chapter advisor for the Alexander Hamilton Society. We just started a chapter this year, and this is our second event. I'm very proud to introduce to you Kamran Kayani, who is our inaugural chapter president. Before I do, let me just say that the Alexander Hamilton Society is a great organization, and it promotes free-spirited debate on subjects of foreign and national security, foreign policy and national security, I should say, from an independent perspective, and with referring back to the founding principles of the country. So we have a very exciting and interesting debate for you today. But without further ado, I hand over to our chapter president. Please help me welcoming Kamran.
All right, thank you so much for that kind introduction. If I do my job right, I'll be getting out of the way very quickly. Have the real experts maybe teach us something. Quickly, just the Hamilton Society, like he said, brings speakers like this to campuses so that students can engage with sort of pertinent ideas facing the foreign policy dilemmas of our time. And the question that I wanted to ask today, because the national security community, I feel like, often talks about differences of technical policy, like, what are the limitations of the JCPOA? How much do we need to fund Cyber Command? And I don't think very often we step back and ask, is this all worth it? Are we freer, safer, and more prosperous because of the massive amount of money that we spend on our armed forces and the private companies that make up our national security apparatus? So we have two fantastic speakers with us today. The first, who will be arguing for the war machine, will be Dr. James Carafano. So he is a graduate of West Point, and he has a master's and a PhD from Georgetown. And he is a 25-year veteran of the Army. And other than being a professor here, he is an all-around fantastic guy. And we also have Dr. Chris Preble, who is the Vice President of Foreign Policy and National Security Studies at the Cato Institute, which is a think tank just down the way from here. And he is also a veteran of the United States Navy, and he has his PhD from Temple. And he's going to be giving us a more libertarian perspective on the military-industrial complex, which, if you look at pollings of young people in this country, is increasingly gaining traction on both the left and right. So I think we do well to listen to what he has to tell us. If you wouldn't mind taking it away?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, sorry. The format that I planned, if everyone agrees, is about 10 minutes to go into your subject, and then a rebuttal that does not exceed 5 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A.
Or less.
So
first of all, disclaimers. So I'm a huge fan of the Alexander Hamilton Society. I'm on the advisory board, and I just think it's a great institution, bringing people to universities and giving the students a chance to interact with them and operate them. And it's a great way to bring like-minded folks together who are interested in these issues and connect them with others. And they have a national meeting, so I'm extremely proud of Daniel Morgan having a chapter, and I think it's a great marriage, and so I'm happy to do that. So normally the format is you invite a speaker from outside the university, and then you have somebody from the faculty kind of balance them. And so I'm in the weird position where this is like the first time I've ever been the balancer, right? So I want to applaud Daniel Morgan for inviting Chris. Chris is an important voice in this debate. We've been doing this together on and off for many, many, many years, but I think Cato brings an important voice and perspective to the discussion. And one of the things that I've been really admired about Daniel Morgan is an institution that really tries to get beyond kind of academia to what's this really all about, and what are the real issues, and how do you come to grips with them. And part of these discussions is this kind of real debate with real people who really know what they're talking about. So kudos for bringing Chris here. He's a brilliant choice. I'm sure I'm no match for him, but there you go. So also, I hate debates. They always frame these things as debate, and the first thing I would say is, I'm not here to debate. I think debates are stupid. They're dumb because people are just trying to score points, and that's not what knowledge creation is about. Knowledge creation is about finding real points of convergence and divergence and understanding why those points exist, and then understanding how does this help inform and enlighten me to think about things. So if we just sit here and try to pick at each other, I mean, that doesn't accomplish anything. So I know Chris is, because we've done this before, we really want to have as a dialogue and talk about these things, and you should try to understand them. The other thing is I'm subversive. I thought the question's stupid, and I reject the premise of the whole debate, right? So the debate is about, is the military-industrial complex making us safer? And my argument is there is no military-industrial complex, so it's a stupid question. And the reason why there's no military-industrial complex is actually not very complex, but there is a little bit of history there, and I just want to kind of go over that very quickly. So this term is really popularized by Dwight Eisenhower, and really it was something that he didn't really formalize and express really until the end of his presidency, most profoundly in his farewell address to the nation. But while it was something that he really didn't articulate in a kind of strategic, forceful way, it was something that actually he worried about his entire presidency. And I just want to explain that. And the reason for that is the nature of American defense spending. So if you look at American defense spending, almost from the day that this guy did, his first paycheck was late, to up until the end of World War II, the pattern was actually pretty much the same. As America averaged about 1 or 2% of GDP on defense spending, right? So we would have made a great, Germany back in the day, and it was really a minimalist approach until we had a war. And then when we had a war, we would ramp up defense spending, and we'd spend a lot of money. Up to, in World War II, it was actually 40% of GDP was spent on, it was an incredible sum. And then traditionally what would happen is the war would over, we'd take a peace dividend, and we would go back to 1 or 2%. And it's this sine curve, and of course the sine curve has got bigger tops because some wars cost more than others, right? So the Spanish-American War is a bit of a blip, Civil War is pretty big, World War I's pretty big, World War II is massive. And then after World War II, we did something that we never did in our history before, which is we did sustained defense spending in peacetime at above a level of about 1 or 2%. And the rationale, the logic for that is that we were fighting in the Cold War, and we had a strategy of being forward and forward prepared to deter war by being prepared to fight at the front end. So essentially, we were arguing we were going to be prepared to fight at World War II, and then hopefully that would actually keep us from fighting one. But being prepared to fight World War II means you almost have to spend as much money as you spent in World War II, and we never quite did that. But if you look at the percentage of defense spending that goes to GDP from about 1948 up to the end of the Cold War, we are in the it varies 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12% range. Obviously, goes up more during Vietnam. That's unprecedented. We have never done that. We have never had a massive military in peacetime. So if you think of an army before World War II, for example, we're like the 20th in the world. So Czechoslovakia could have kicked our butt, right? And literally, we had millions of men under arms in peacetime during the expanse of the Cold War. And so here's Eisenhower's concern. It's not just that it's a massive amount of spending in percentage of GDP. It is an unprecedented amount of federal spending. In Eisenhower's age, defense spending was 50% of the federal budget. Little things like Social Security, that was 1/5 of the federal budget. Today it's reversed. Today, defense spending is like less than 1/5 of the federal budget. Entitlement spending is about 50% of the federal budget. And if you add up other things, we actually spend more on them than we do on defense. So defense is not even in the top 3 or 4 items that we spend most of our money on. But look at it from Eisenhower's perspective, that you're spending half of your federal budget on defense. You're spending an enormous amount of GDP, and then when you dig into that, some of the numbers are really profound. Overwhelming percentage of research and development during the Cold War was done by the government. Private sector R&D was virtually minuscule compared to, and of the R&D in government, overwhelming most of it was defense. Although that was Eisenhower's biggest concern, actually arguably one of his greatest policy successes was the military defense complex never operationalized, right? So the concern is that you were spending so much money and you had so much power and authority concentrated in a corporate structure of government and non-government people, that actually might be so powerful that it might overwhelm the political process, right? Much in the way that Russian oligarchs have so much money and power and authority that even though they're outside the formal governing structure of government, they cast a shadow or gravity that's so large that it pulls the planets in their direction. That was his concern, and it was, I think, arguably a legitimate concern, because we had never had a condition like that in American history, where this government, non-governmental coalition existed in peacetime for a very long time and was a potential competitor for the actual people running the country. And the notion was, that he expressed in the speech, was that it would be so powerful that, and essentially, they would be making interests in the best interest of the complex, not necessarily as the best interest of the nation. So for example, if your concern was disarmament or reducing tensions with the Russians, that the complex might be against that because it might mean less spending or less influence for that. So that was his concern. So that, remember, that's the concern. It's so big, and it's operationalized as a political force that's not just influencing policy, it's driving the political decisions. Like, let's go attack Albania, right? Well, the first thing is, although he complains about that is at the end of his presidency, Eisenhower really did much during his presidency to ensure that that didn't happen, including constraining defense spending. Eisenhower was actually, even though he was a former military guy, he was actually a proponent of cheap defense and was looking for ways to economize. One of the reasons why we have more nuclear weapons is because he thought we could save money because they were cheaper than having more conventional forces. So he used the argument for more nuclear spending to actually decrease conventional spending. And he cheated, right? He came up with all kinds of things that were national security that we spent money on that really weren't national security, like the National Highway Program, which we built, right, so we could all evacuate the cities in the event of a nuclear war. But really, he was just doing shovel-ready infrastructure projects, right, which would be good for the economy. So there's a wonderful book about this that I highly recommend by Aaron Friedberg called The Rise of the Garrison State. And where he basically argues that the concern was that the United States essentially become like the Soviet Union was during the Cold War, which was essentially a military-industrial complex with a country attached to it, right? And the argument was is we would lose the Cold War, we would lose our soul, and in the end we might actually lose the competition if we did that. And the important thing is that we always remained a country with a military and an associated industrial base attached to it. That was actually Eisenhower's priority during his tenure, and I actually think he was pretty successful. That's the argument that Aaron makes in the Rise of the Garrison State. And one of the proofs of that is when the actual Cold War ends, we actually go back to a relatively similar model. Defense spending quickly starts to decline. And today, even at the height of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, defense spending was actually only around less than 4% of GDP. Today it's less than 3% of GDP. So it's not 1 or 2%, right? So we're not, Germany and France, but we are not anywhere near the historic highs that we were in the Cold War. The other thing is the defense industrial base is not what it was in the 1940s and 1950s when Eisenhower wrote. If you looked at the major corporations in America, many of them were defense companies. And many of the companies that weren't defense companies were doing a lot of defense work. So arguably the defense industrial base was maybe the single largest industrial concern in the United States, except for maybe automakers, right? So they were a massive economic force. Today you will not find one American defense company in the top 50, with maybe the exception of Boeing. And Boeing is there not because they're a defense company, it's because they're a big aircraft company that just happens to also make military airplanes. And the major movers and shakers in the economic sphere is not the defense industry by any stretch of the imagination, right? It is Amazon and Apple and the tech companies. I mean, these are trillion-dollar companies. You could add up the entire defense industrial base, and I don't think you could get a trillion-dollar company. So they are actually very minor players in the macroeconomic force in America, and their political influence is commensurate with that. Obviously, defense companies have some impact when you're talking about whether you want to buy an F-35 and who you should buy F-35.
But if it comes to the argument, like, should we be in the Vietnam War? Should we, should we be fighting in Iraq or Afghanistan? Should we be in Somalia? Their political weight is actually very lightweight. And actually, historically, what we've seen is in the last decades is the major defense companies have really stayed out of the more macro foreign policy and military debates, and really kind of focused on the core business of just getting business for their companies. So it's very difficult to argue that the military-industrial complex in any way drives American foreign and defense policy. It's very, very difficult to argue that they are anything close to the largest corporate interests in the United States. So you may think defense spending is too high. You may think we shouldn't be buying this or buying that. But you can't rationally make the argument that what Eisenhower was concerned about is a problem today. And I'll just end on this vignette, which was, it's amazing how resilient the military-industrial complex rhetoric has been, even though the reality of the military-industrial complex has completely vanished. And one of the most interesting illustrations of that was during the Bush administration. At the height of the Iraq War, when there was a resurgence in the whole military-industrial complex rhetoric, and to the point that there was a film on the military-industrial complex that began with Eisenhower's speech. And the argument essentially was, we have all these military contractors, and they're essentially driving military policy, and they're pushing war because it's good for making profit. This was basically the whole type. So if you know much about military contracting, in many ways, military contractors are a significant portion of the defense industrial base. In some cases, in some areas, they're actually a bigger player than people that make hardware, like unless you're making like a aircraft carrier or something. So they're not an insignificant player in the military space, but they in terms of an economic force that's driving policy, it's pretty small. So what's really interesting about that rhetoric, and there was this documentary which came out stunningly right before the elections, which I think was just this incredible coincidence, right? That there's this documentary attacking the Bush administration, accusing them of being profiteers, that comes out right before the election. I mean, what are the odds, right? So what's really interesting is President Obama gets elected, and the rhetoric completely vanishes. You couldn't find a copy of the movie today, maybe on YouTube or something. There was a massive commission on military contracting that did this huge giant report on this perception. This was a big problem. As far as I can tell, zero of the recommendations were actually implemented by the US government. And yet, the concerns and the fear of the military-industrial complex and these, mercenaries and everything virtually vanishes under Obama, which is interesting because, with very few exceptions, the companies that are doing military contracting under Obama are exactly the same companies that were doing military contracting under Bush. So apparently they were the root of all evil, and then somehow they magically weren't. Now, were they doing less? Yeah, I mean, because as the cost of the war went down, they were kind of doing, but they're doing the same kinds of things. They're doing it to the same level. So if you actually look at the level of spending on contractors compared to the overall budget under Obama, it's about the same as Bush. So why was there a resurgent fear of the military-industrial complex? A cynical person might argue it's just rhetorical politics. And I think that's actually true. And with that, I will yield the floor.
Okay, please, Dr. Carroll.
Thanks. It's good to be here with Jim, and thanks for the invitation to be here. I should have known, Jim and I met each other before we started at Heritage at Cato, and I should have known that Jim was going to steal my historian's thunder, because he's a good historian too. I do think, I'll just make a couple quick points, because I agree with him that I think it'd be much more useful as a dialogue than as a debate. But let me just make a few quick points. First of all, we do disagree, Jim and I, on whether or not there is a military-industrial complex. And I think that it's partly because of the way we define it. I don't define the complex merely as a function of the businesses that are that are primarily engaged in supplying materiel and support to the U.S. military. It also includes the think tanks and the universities that are dependent upon federal government money. Jim mentioned the role the federal government played in terms of basic research during the Cold War. That's why we remember Eisenhower's warning about the military-industrial complex. In the same speech, he warned about the scientific and technological elite in that same speech, and that's what he was talking about the danger that the federal government's funding of basic science and research would cause universities and even companies to sort of respond to those incentives, and that would change their priorities. I think that's happened to a certain extent. But we are debating about the complex as a political and economic entity, not the military as a military, qua-military. The military-industrial complex that Eisenhower was worried about was this conjunction of political and economic interests that didn't exist in American society before the Second World War. As Jim mentioned, and in the speech, Eisenhower talks about how when in the past, when the government needed to raise the necessary materiel to arm the military, the makers of plowshares turned to making swords. And then when the war was over, they went back to their own business. And what concerned him was the permanence of this entity. I think what betrays a little bit why Jim's version of the story isn't entirely accurate is because that permanent industry did persist after the end of the Cold War. Yes, the amount of spending as a percentage of GDP went down, but today the United States of America is spending more on its military in inflation-adjusted dollars than we did during the Cold War. Look it up. So the persistence and permanence of this conjunction of military and political interests has persisted. Part of the reason why libertarians care about this so much is because Jim likes Aaron Friedberg's book, In the Shadow of the Garrison State. It is an excellent book. Aaron's an excellent scholar. I also would recommend reading Robert Higgs' Crisis in Leviathan. The reason why the founders wanted to keep the military establishment small, and of course the Constitution stipulates no standing army. We have a Navy. The Navy had pride of place in the Constitution, but not the Army. Was precisely because they worried that a permanent military establishment would grow the power of the state. That's why libertarians care so deeply about containing this power. We see the growth of the state go hand in hand with the ability to wage war. If I did nothing else tonight than to convince all of you to go back and listen or watch, it's on YouTube, watch President Eisenhower's speech on January 17, 1961. If that's all I made you do, I would consider this event a success. It's a remarkable speech by a man who was not a remarkable speaker. Okay? It was overshadowed for many years by John F. Kennedy's inaugural address, which was 3 days later, of course. But if you read that speech or listen to it or watch it, I do think you will hear some things that really resonate now, 57 years later. What comes through in that speech and what was a theme of Eisenhower's work, not just during his presidency, but throughout his life, was even though this was a man, West Point class of 1915, a man who lived most of his life in the military, in uniform, obviously the great hero of the European theater in World War II, and yet he never believed that military spending was a good thing for the economy. He always believed that it was, at best, a necessary evil. He believed that every dollar spent on the military was, of necessity, taken out of the private economy. It was not, in that sense, a positive-sum game. It was a zero-sum game. In that sense, he was right. Most of the case, when people talk about zero-sum game, they're wrong, but in this sense, he's right. He talked about opportunity costs. My other favorite Eisenhower speech was the Chance for Peace speech, which was delivered in April of 1953, one of his first public speeches as president. And in that speech, he spells out the trade-offs between what it costs to buy a bomber relative to the number of houses that could build, or what a ship would cost relative to the number of, the miles of asphalt roads and highways that could be built. There are trade-offs, and he constantly hammered this point. So when I look at the size of the US military today relative to where it was in the Cold War and relative to the nature of the threat that we're facing today, I think there is a disconnect. I don't see a danger as grave as the one that we were arming to defeat in the Cold War. The Soviet Union was a real thing. They had a huge army lodged in Europe. They had ships, they had planes, they had nuclear weapons, okay? All of those things. And I look at the nature of the threats we're facing today, and it's not nearly as severe as it was back then. And, not incidentally, the countries that we defended from that large, rapacious Soviet Union in the late 1940s, 50s, and 60s and beyond were once weak and pitiful and broken by not just one but two wars. And the countries that we're defending today are no longer weak and pitiful. They're strong and vibrant and certainly capable of defending themselves. So let me just close with, again, promise me, all of you, look me in the eye, promise me, you'll read this speech. It's really good. I'm not going to read the passages of the speech, even though it's really good. You know that I can trust that you're going to do that. So I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to read the speech. I'm going to close with this. I think that Jim does not take seriously enough the danger, or even the mere possibility, that some very interested parties care so much about what provides them their livelihoods that they might not, from time to time, act in their private interest in a way that is contrary to the public interest. This is a concept that we all know. Libertarians talk about a lot, public choice. Concentrated benefits, diffuse costs. It's true, the size of the military relative to the US economy is much smaller than it used to be, and yet the people who are heavily dependent upon the military are very interested in maintaining spending as high as it possibly can go, and the rest of us spend only a little bit, very, very small amount individually to pay them. Concentrated benefits, diffuse costs. We see that play out over and over and again in the case of the US military and the people who provide it. As a way of preparing for this speech, I asked one of my fine interns at Cato. I once was a Cato intern. We have a great intern program at Cato. You should check it out. Just sort of curious, just find me a couple examples in the last couple weeks of sort of egregious cost abuses by various contractors. I learned about a multi-million-dollar refrigerator that was proposed to be installed in the in Air Force One. I learned about, really, you can look it up. I learned about the plan to build new helicopters to replace the UH-1s, which are maybe not necessary, maybe are, not entirely sure, but it's a very, very large program. We learned about a plan to certify Saudi Arabia as, every arms sale, foreign arms sale, has to be approved by the State Department. And the advice that Secretary Pompeo was getting from the career civil servants, career State Department people, was this was a bad idea. And yet, a former Raytheon employee who is now the head of legislative affairs at the State Department impressed upon Secretary Pompeo that, in fact, we should certify the sale, and lo and behold, yes, Raytheon is a beneficiary of what will be a $2 billion sale to Saudi. So we can think of instances like that. This is all just in the last couple weeks. And the F-35 is a running punchline to every single joke relative to procurement. I mean, I don't, that part I don't have to make up. And by the way, I wrote a paper many years ago for the Cato Institute bragging about what a great aircraft the Joint Strike Fighter would be. So I wish I could have that one back. So I think that, just to close, we have to take seriously Eisenhower's warning. We have to remember where we were as a country before World War I, where we were in 1961, where we were in 1991 after the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and where we are today. And I think that if Eisenhower was with us today, he would look at where we are, and contrary to what Jim said, he would look at where we are and say, this is precisely what I warned you all about on January 17, 1961. Thank you.
You know, I thought your part about rapacious self-interest is pretty cool. It's a horrible way to talk about Canadians.
Was that a joke?
Yeah, I got it. Well, anyway, so we agree, we absolutely totally agree. Eisenhower was a horrible public speaker. So it's just one point before I kind of comment on some of the points is what's interesting about, and not only did I say read the speech, studying the life and presidency of Dwight David Eisenhower, it is fascinating. Great book by Mike Duran. What's it called? Eisenhower. Awesome book about a leader struggling and learning in presidency. It's true, but just his whole presidency is really worth studying. There's been a renaissance in Eisenhower scholarship in the last couple of years. He was kind of treated in his day as kind of this doty grandfather who really didn't kind of know what's going on. And it's really only been since the late 1980s that they went back and dug into the archives and talked to some of the old veterans about the hidden hand and how he operated behind the front. And he really was an incredibly thoughtful, hands-on, important president. So he's very understudied. You know, it's interesting because Eisenhower was, although he wouldn't probably kind of formally acknowledge that because he came up in the military background and they just didn't do politics. But he was, just because he was from the Midwest, he was at his heart a conservative. And he was a confluence of all the elements of the conservative movement. If you think of fiscal responsibility and the free markets, the importance of defending the country and national security, and individual rights and liberties, all of those were part of Eisenhower's DNA. But what's interesting about them is, if you look at how that plays out in his presidency, fiscal responsibility is up here. That was his #1 goal, was to get the American economy growing and to unleash it and let people make money. That was the most important thing to him. And this is a military guy. And I would say national security was down here. And we neglect actually his contributions in human rights and civil rights, and they were not unimportant. They were not as high profile as the other two, but all those elements of the presidency are down there. But ironically, you know, the military guy, for him, economic freedom and fiscal responsibility was the most important jewel in the crown. I want to just unpack again briefly some of the things you talked about, because you mentioned the scientific part of the military-industrial complex, and I actually think that makes my argument. If you look at this notion that scientific R&D would be captured by the military, that actually died very early on. It died in the 1960s and late 60s and early 70s. Largely died as a result of the Vietnam War, where the war was so deeply unpopular in academia that a lot of academia essentially refused to work with the military. It started with anthropologists. Anthropologists were really the fathers of the, actually they were fathers because most of those guys were guys. They were really the father of the academic anti-war movement in the United States, and it spread from there to other disciplines. But it was very, very common by the end of the mid-70s for a lot of universities to refuse to do national security related work because they didn't want to be associated with the warmongers and baby killers. So we actually saw that part of Eisenhower's career die relatively quickly. And although RAND is, we have significant FFRDCs, again, if you look at the FFRDCs and the government-run and even government-supported part of the think tank community today, it's pretty pitiful compared to the 17,000 plus think tanks that we have, most of whom are funded and supported and work on issues that aren't driven by the complex. And the last thing I'll say is, if you look at private R&D, when we just had this case with Google or Apple, Google, where they had it was Google, it had the AI contract with the US government, this Project Maven, where basically they said, okay, we're not going to do that because we don't want to be associated with military R&D. And what we have today is a model of not the military-industrial complex driving R&D in America. What we have is a robust American R&D program And for the large part, the military tries to siphon off and steal the innovation from the private sector. It's not the other way around. So I think there's no more profound an example of that. And again, if the question is there a corporatist complex that is trying to influence political policy outside the democratic process, it ain't the military-industrial complex. I'm not saying corporatism is a problem, because we could have a big discussion about other non-government entities that maybe are more, a bigger challenge to the democratic process, and I do that. Just two other points real quick. One is on this is why Chris and I are both right, because we both use our numbers in different ways. So he uses it in absolute terms, and they sound really big, like 80 billion gazillion dollars. Wow, that's a big number, right? I use it in relative terms because I think that's more meaningful, because it's relative to wealth. And Americans spend more on beer and pizza every year than we do in the U.S. Army. So if you're worried about the evil people taking over, go look at the Domino's dudes in Budweiser, because they're making a lot more money than the guys building the Army, right? So we spend more on, until recent, actually we still do, we spend more on movie tickets than the rest of the world. Right? So we spend more on defense than everybody else combined, okay, fine. We spend more on diamonds than everybody. These are kind of meaningless comparisons, right? I mean, you have to look at it relative. And like I said, we spend less than 4% of GDP on defense. Putting that in context, Chris is right. None of the bad guys that we face today are on the scale of the Soviet Union. But, right, if you look at the bad guy list, and to be fair, the bad guy list is bipartisan. Bush, Obama, and Trump all had the same bad guy list. It was Korea, Iran, Russia, China, transnational terrorism. So at least all of our last three presidents agree on what the bad guy list you have to worry about. If you add them all up, they don't add up to the Soviet Union, but they add up to actually a pretty substantial threat. And the United States is a global power with global interests who has to address all of them. And if you look at what we're spending spending about 3% of GDP. That's less than half what we spent fighting the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So I actually argue you're getting a bargain, because you've got a threat that's kind of comparable, and you're actually spending less on that. And looking in comparison to the Europeans, we said the Europeans should spend about 2% of GDP on defense. If you actually kind of look at the macro level, their total defense, their total security threats are about half ours, right? And we're about double theirs. So them spending 2%, us spending 4%, similar economies. Actually, if you look at the scales, it sounds to me like, from the macro level, we're not in a bad place.
Sure. So trust me when I tell all of you that someday the share of your take-home pay that you will spend on housing will be less than it is right now. Trust me when I tell you that, okay? You will make more money as you progress in your careers, and therefore the share that you spend on your living expenses will decline.
Unless you get divorced and she gets everything.
Don't do that, okay? He's right, don't do that. What will happen as you get older and you have families and kids and you want a backyard with a swing set, you will define upwards what you need for to live in, right? And yet it will still decline. So in other words, sorry, my bad. I'm leaning forward. See this one. So just remember, yes, we're spending less as a share of our total economy, but spending more in real terms because our economy's grown a lot. Okay, and that's a good thing. And Eisenhower would say that's the point, right? We should be growing our economy and not diverting resources into unproductive things, which he still sees, which he saw in the military as being mostly unproductive. Two other quick points. Jim said earlier, I wrote this down because it was really good. Back in the 1930s, Czechoslovakia could have kicked our butts. Yes, if they were really good swimmers. Okay? Again, part of the reason why the founders were confident that a relatively small national security state could keep this country quite secure is because geography mattered then and still matters today. Okay? Even though technology has changed things, it hasn't evaporated the seas. the time distance problem has not yet been solved, although Amazon is working on it very hard. Okay, so there is something to be said for a country like the United States that has a large and dynamic economy and that has peaceful, friendly neighbors, more or less friendly, to the north and south, and fish to the east and west. And then you ask yourself, is that large military actually needed to keep this country safe and secure? So this is my last point, is that on balance, the military-industrial complex, or whatever you want to call it, if you want to call it a complex, would be a good deal for the United States if it helped us win the wars we need to win and didn't get us into wars that we don't need to fight. And I think that that's not the case. I think that we have sadly, and it's not the military's fault at all, we have a uneven track record in the wars of the last 20 years, and that's partly because we've gotten into some wars that we didn't need to fight in the first place.
Yep.
All right, well, thank you guys for your contributions. We'd like to go into question and answer now. And if it goes very poorly, I think Daniel Morgan's flintlock pistols are somewhere around here. We can go into a duel.
But the good news is I'm class at 6:30, and so do you. So we'll be done by then. There's a limit.
All right, so you said you don't believe in the military-industrial complex. Are there ways that you think whatever this corporate institution is, the acquisition process can be made more efficient and cost-effective?
Yeah, I mean, actually, that's something that Chris and I completely agree on. I mean, we agree on economics, right? Which is federal spending takes money out of the economy, right? And it's taking money out of people's pockets. And in a free society, the goal is to maximize freedom. And so as much as possible, people should have their wealth and they should distribute it and invest it the way they want. And we should have a minimalist approach to how much money is coming into the federal government. So of course, my first argument would be, let's look at all the stuff we're spending on the federal government, and which includes defense, and we should have a broad argument about should we be spending money on all these things. I mean, right, and we should be spending it all efficiently, right? So yeah, I think every part of the federal government has an obligation, one, not to spend things on that we don't need, and two, to be a good steward of the resources that you're given. And so we actually work on things together. So for example, we still have a lot of infrastructure that's left over from the Cold War that's still there because, anybody here he looks like a congressman, because of him, right? His district, he is not giving up the base in his district, so he will do whatever we can to get that base, even though its only purpose was to provide hay for the cavalry that was fighting the Apaches. It doesn't matter. He's going to hold on to that damn base if he can help it, right? So this is often called BRAC, which is base realignment and closure, which is, if you went to Google and you say you have to keep a warehouse that you don't need and never use, Google will look at you and say, are you a whack job or what? I mean, that's ridiculous, right? But yet we tell the military they have to keep infrastructure that they don't need and they don't use because it's politically convenient for us to do that. But it's just taking money out of the pocket of citizens, and it actually hurts the military because they have to spend money on stuff they don't need. So something we agree on is let's have really efficient base alignment and closure, and just have the military have the infrastructure we want. So that's so that those things we cooperate on and work on together.
And what would you say to some of the things he mentioned, like the highway system or ARPANET that later became the internet, some of the things that we do have in the civilian world as a result of the, let's not call it the military-industrial complex, but
well, I think this is a case where Jim and I actually do agree in that there are occasional spin-offs from military technology that were, some of which were intended, but many of which were unintended, the famous microwave coming from radars. But in fact, we agree that it would be better to leave resources in the private sector where they are more efficiently allocated, as opposed to, the alternative is to throw lots and lots of money into federal government research with the hope that some of that spin off. It's just completely backwards, and that's the part that really frustrated Eisenhower the most. I mean, part of my Eisenhower has been all but written out of the Republican Party pantheon. I think it's really quite sad. I think part of the reason why is because he questioned this It's also because his critique of the military-industrial complex was sort of captured by the progressive left in the 1960s and 70s. And if you go back and look at his career, going back even when he was a major in the Army in the early 1930s, he completely rejected the argument that you solve the military-industrial complex problem by taking profits out of the business. Yeah. And he didn't believe that. He was a conservative. He was a fiscal conservative. He believed in private enterprise. Believed in private sector. So getting back to your question, Cameron, I think that in the few instances in which there are beneficial spin-offs for civilians from military industry, that's fine, but they are precisely that, spin-offs. They are merely just sort of happy coincidences. We should not over-invest in the military with the expectation that more happy coincidences will occur.
Right. We got more of those back then because more of the R&D spending was in the military.
Yes, right.
Now more of the R&D spending is in the private sector. And oh my God, where is all the innovation coming from? By and large from the private sector.
Right.
You said if you were a cynical man, you might say that critiques of the military-industrial complex are done on a partisan basis. What is your case to libertarians like Dr. Preble who think that it does influence our policy process?
Chris is the driven snow. His comment's exactly right. One of the problems with the debate about the military-industrial complex was it was captured by the left, and it became this kind of boogeyman to attack, everything, right? And it never got. I mean, Chris and I, when we just sit at the end of the day, all we're arguing about is things like what's the most efficient, efficacious thing to do. Which isn't that what public policy should be about, right? But that's not how the military-industrial complex is being used in public discourse.
Right.
And a similar question for you.
And that's not Chris's fault.
Thanks, Joe. It's not.
Because you were like 5 in the 1960s.
Yeah. A similar question for you. You said you talked about after the Cold War, but our most recent NSS kind of declared that great power conflict is back. What is your case against that?
How much time you got? I think there is a serious problem with the current national security strategy as it is framed. Okay, I don't disagree with Secretary Mattis and others that we sort of misaligned our focus, or we became overly focused on. And for understandable reasons, after 9/11, we understand this. We became overly focused on non-state actors and state failure and weak states and things like that, and less focused on rising powers like China. The problem, however, is the fiscal imbalance, which the national security strategy does not address. There is a serious problem between what the United States government spends, not just in the military, but across the board, and what it's bringing in. And the additional irony of all this, so in other words, you'll hear the debt to GDP ratio of either, it's maybe 1-to-1, if you count only publicly held debt, it's a little bit less than that. But if you look at the actual fiscal imbalance, which is with the promises that we have made to people through entitlements like Social Security and Medicare, relative to what we have committed to pay for those things, the imbalance is closer to 6 or 7 times what you hear as the publicly held debt. We have a serious problem, ladies and gentlemen, with respect to our fiscal situation. And how are we planning to solve this problem, at least in the near term? Sell bonds to foreign holders, of whom the #1 foreign holder is either China or Japan, depending upon what month of the year you're looking at.
Right.
So there is a huge difference between competing with the Soviet Union, where we were not dependent upon them economically, to now, as Hillary Clinton famously said in a moment of perhaps too much candor to the Australian Prime Minister, how do you deal toughly with your banker? We're going to find out.
So Chris and I agree that there's a fiscal imbalance problem here, and that if you look at the national security strategy, we're not actually funding the military at the level we need to do to sustain that strategy, right? And we're in a deficit spending. I would just argue that, it reminds me of the kids around the dinner table and dad comes in and says, I can't pay the bills this month. We're gonna have to cut back at something. And the kids say, no problem, Dad, just don't pay the mortgage anymore. Cannot cut Netflix, and I cannot cut down on my data usage, right? I mean, I think we need to have a more serious conversation about, not that we shouldn't be more efficient in defense spending, because we should, but we want a serious conversation about everything we're spending money on, and are we actually prioritizing that correctly? Right. And are we actually doing the things we need to grow the economy so we can afford to defend ourselves? So, yeah.
I have, not knowing that Jim was going to say that, but suspecting that he might, I printed out, and you're not going to be able to see it, but the President's proposed budget for 2019 proposed to cut the State Department by 29% and increases to Defense, DHS, and Veterans Affairs of DHS 12%, Defense 13%, Veterans Affairs 15%. Jim and I actually agree that all of the stuff in the middle is probably not needed, but that is precisely the imbalance that I worry about, where we cut diplomacy, which is already what? The State Department's budget is what? 1/9 that of the Pentagon's, roughly, I think? Around that sort of ballpark figure. That's not the right approach, right? That's not what we should be doing. Jim and I can agree that most of the things in the middle could safely go away, like really, but it's the stuff at the top and bottom we're not aligning our research.
So there's actually something else in the national security strategy that I think we agree on, which is problematic, and that is the way they talk about the industrial base. So this administration makes a case that the industrial base is national security concern, and therefore we need government intervention and protectionist measures in order to protect that. So nobody disputes Alexander Hamilton because he was a great rapper. When he did his manufacturing base report for the Congress, he said there's only 3 logical reasons for tariffs. He goes, raise revenue, okay, to drive reciprocity in the behavior of your trading partners,